それではこれより招待講演に入ります。本日最初のご講演は、ハーバード大学のジョセフ・ナイ先生にお願いしております。ナイ先生は、アメリカ国際政治学の重鎮の一人で、パワーと相互依存、ソフトパワー、スマートパワーなど、斬新な概念を数多く生み出してこられました。また、歴代のアメリカ民主党政権で国防次官補などの要職を務められました。さらに、知日派の国際政治学者として、日米関係に関するさまざまな政策提言をされています。今日の演題は、アメリカと日本は中国にいかに向き合うべきか、How should the United States and Japan handle China? です。それでは、ナイ先生、ご用意ができたらよろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back in Tokyo with Tokyo International University and Chancellor Kurata and also my good friend Yukio Okamoto. I will address the issue of the rise of China and how US and Japan should respond to the rise of China. And I think it is probably one of the major issues of our century, that if we get this wrong, we're going to have a much less successful century than if we're able to manage this properly. The question really has been put by some as the danger that we're entering into a new Cold War period, that the relationship between the US and China will resemble that between the US and the Soviet Union after 1945, and that will obviously have enormous implications for Japan, because not only is Japan a neighbor to China, but also is closely allied with the US. So we can't think about the question of a US-China relationship without realizing that it is a triangle, that Japan, US, and China are deeply intertwined in this relationship. So the issue then of what are we likely to see in terms of the next decade or so is one which well deserves our attention. About a year ago, in October of 2018, Vice President Mike Pence gave a speech about US-China relations, in which he had a very harsh criticism of China, and many people said that marked the beginning of the next Cold War, or that this was the second declaration of Cold War. I think the trouble with that analogy, the metaphor of Cold War, is that it's highly misleading. If one looks back at the real Cold War that we saw between the United States and the Soviet Union, it's worth remembering that in that Cold War, the two countries had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons aimed at each other and had virtually no trade and virtually no cultural ties. By contrast, China has a limited nuclear force, and annual Sino-American trade totals $500 billion, and there are more than 350,000 Chinese students studying in the United States, and more than 3 million tourists who come to the US from China each year. In contrast, during the real Cold War, there are almost no Soviet students, and there was almost no trade between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the people who talk about a new Cold War have to realize that the metaphor is not a very good fit for the US-China relationship. If you look at the longer period of history since 1945, you'll see that the U.S.-China relationship has gone through 3 phases that lasted roughly 2 decades each. The first 20 years basically were years of hostility. Remember, the United States and China actually fought bitter battles on the Korean Peninsula in 1950. The period after 1972, the United States and China began to cooperate primarily because both of them were concerned about the growth of the Soviet Union, and this was the period after Nixon's famous trip to China. The period after that, the next 20 years, was a period of U.S. and China rapprochement and economic integration, which was marked by this development of the trade ties and social ties that I described earlier. And some people would say that that third period came to an end in the last year or two. Now, if you look back and ask from a historical purpose, how would you associate this? You might say that first period was associated with President Truman, who took American troops into Korea. The second phase was associated with President Nixon, who opened the door to China. And the third phase is often associated with President Clinton, who helped support China's joining the World Trade Organization. And people say this fourth phase that we're seeing now is associated with President Trump. But that's really too simple. If you ask why is there difficulty in the U.S.-China relationship today, it's not just because of President Trump. Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, deserves equal blame. By rejecting Deng Xiaoping's prudent policy of maintaining a low international profile, and by ending presidential term limits and proclaiming his nationalistic China dream, Xi Jinping might as well have been wearing a little red hat that said, "Make China great again," like Trump has a little red hat that says, "Make America great again." The conventional wisdom, which says that the current difficulties are all Trump's fault, neglect the fact that the situation between the United States and China have begun to sour even before the 2016 election. In fact, you might make an argument that there was a fire that was smoldering in U.S.-China relationships, and that President Trump was a man who came along and poured gasoline on the fire. So the fire flared up, but it doesn't mean that he lit the fire. So what lit the fire? What created this fire that Trump then added the gasoline to? And I would argue that a lot of that was created by China, that the liberal international order that the Americans created after World War II helped China sustain rapid economic growth and reduce poverty dramatically. China has had a very impressive record of raising hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and it deserves great credit for that. But China also tilted the field of international trade in its own favor. It had state-owned enterprises which received subsidies from Chinese banks as they competed with Japanese or American or European firms. So the playing field wasn't level, it was tilted in that sense. And it also used various forms of coercive intellectual property transfer, some of them just by market access, but others illegal stealing of intellectual property, as ways to essentially push for an unfair advantage. And many people then felt, even before the 2016 election, that China wasn't playing fair, that China was essentially manipulating the international trade system in its favor through these devices of subsidies to state-owned enterprises and coercive intellectual property transfer. Now, that is one of the arguments that President Trump has been using for the current trade war with China, which of course spills over on Japan. Japan and China have a very important economic relationship, and as the Chinese economy is disrupted by this trade war, that then affects the Japanese economy as well. Now, Trump's view of how you go about trying to tell China that they have not played fair is, in my opinion, very clumsy. He should have worked with our allies in Europe and Japan to use the World Trade Organization to get a collective pressure on China to stop these practices of state-owned subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and coercive intellectual property transfer. But instead, he decided to act more or less unilaterally. And he also has an odd impression that somehow the bilateral trade balance is the way to measure whether there's a good or bad economic relationship. Most economists will tell you that bilateral trade balances are not the right way to make this type of judgment. And Trump essentially has used clumsy means and the wrong measure, but behind that you can make a case that he was justified in pushing back against China for the practices that lit this metaphor of the fire that I referred to. Now, this has led to a difference within Washington as to how one should resolve the current trade disputes. For some, particularly the president, if China would just promise to buy a lot more from the United States, that would be a victory for the United States. For others, which would include people like the Special Trade Representative, Mr. Lighthizer, and others, this mistakes the real nature of the problem. The real nature of the problem is China's unfair practices with technology. So, for example, China complains about the Americans not allowing Huawei to build the 5G technology for the next generation of internet. And yet when you ask Chinese why they object to this, they say, well, it's unfair, it's discriminatory trade practice. And you ask them, well, what about Google? Do you allow Google to act in China? Oh, that's a different question entirely. So if we say that a company like Huawei, for security reasons, should not be allowed to operate on a particular technology in the US, the Chinese complain. But when the Chinese say that for security reasons, a company like Google can't operate in China, that doesn't bother them. So there is an unevenness here, and what worries me is that if President Trump tries to solve this current trade dispute by agreeing to allow China to buy a lot more soybeans or natural gas, it won't address the real issue. And the real issue is that if Huawei, which is highly beholden to the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party, is able to control our networks in the US or in Japan, it's a very major security risk for us. And we should set up rules which essentially say this is not to be allowed, while at the same time allowing trade in other areas. So this is an example of the type of inequality or what we call unfairness, which is behind the current dispute, but also of what I would call the confusion in the Trump administration of how to resolve the dispute. In addition to the problems that we have with Huawei and other companies that are possible security threats, there is a military component to the concern about the U.S.-China relations, which of course very much affects Japan as well. And in that sense, while this new dimension of the relationship, the fourth phase of the relationship, is not a Cold War because of the high degree of interdependence, both economic and social, it's not just a typical trade dispute. It's not just a matter which, if the Chinese would buy more soybeans or stop subsidizing state-owned enterprises, everything would be all right. There has to be a broader understanding and rules of the road about what is acceptable behavior. Now, some people argue that what I've described for you so far, the current problems that we've seen in the last 2 years of the that are highly associated with the Trump administration, but which I say goes back to have earlier roots. Some people say that it's not a Cold War, it's going to be worse. It could become a hot war. I have a colleague at Harvard who argues that there's a great danger that this fourth phase of the U.S.-China relationship since 1945 marks beginning of a conflict in which an established hegemon or great power goes to war with a rising challenger, and that this is what has been called a Thucydides trap, and that is named after the Greek historian Thucydides, who argued that the Peloponnesian War, in which the Greek city-state system tore itself apart in the 5th century BC, was caused by the rise in the power of Athens and the fear that created in Sparta. And the argument that's made by people who accept this point of view is that China's rise in the 21st century will create a similar fear in the United States, and they reinforce this analogy by saying that this is what happened a century ago with the 20th century. You had, at the beginning of the 20th century, the rise in the power of Germany, which created great fear in the established leading power, Britain, and this then led to the World War, which tore the European state system apart and which caused Europe to cease to be the center of the global balance of power. My colleague at Harvard, Graham Allison, has written a book about this, and he calls the book, the title of his book is Destined for War. I think that, frankly, is an exaggeration because in many ways World War I was far more complex than this simple Thucydides trap analogy. Basically, the causes involved the rise of Russian power, which created fear in Germany, rising nationalism in the Balkans and other countries, and risks that were deliberately taken by the Habsburg Empire to stave off its own collapse, which was imminent. But it's also worth noticing that the analogy doesn't work because Germany had already surpassed Britain in industrial production by 1900, while China's gross domestic product, measured in dollars, is currently only about 3/5 the size of the U.S. economy. So while Germany had passed Britain at the beginning of the 20th century, contrary to conventional wisdom, China has not passed the United States in terms of its economic size. And that makes a difference because it means there's more time to deal with this problem, that if one looks at the situation of the balance of power in East Asia, the U.S. and Japan still hold the higher cards in the relationship. In fact, China is constrained by the existence of a natural balance of power in Asia. And in that sense, Japan, which is the third largest economy in the world, and India, which is about to pass Japan in population, have no desire to be dominated by China. So the prospect that you're going to see a situation like you saw a century ago at the beginning of the 20th century, I think is exaggerated. In addition to that, there's a conventional view that goes along with this, that Britain was in decline at the beginning of the 20th century and that the US is in decline at the beginning of the 21st century. I have written and argued that America has many problems, and I would bore you if I listed them all for you, but it's not really a country in decline the way, let's say, the Roman Empire was in decline. If one looks at some of the basic measures of strength of a nation, the US is not doing very badly at all. For example, take demography, the growth in population. The US is the only major industrial power which will have its same ranking, number 3, in 2050 that it has today. China, which ranks number 1 in population today, will be replaced by India as the largest country in population. So today it's China, India, US. In 2050 it'll be India, China, US. But even more important, China's population reached, the labor force reached its peak in 2015, partly as a result of the one-child policy. And China will face a number of problems related to demography that the US will not. The second area to notice is if we thought back a decade or so ago, you'd see that the United States was heavily dependent upon imported oil for its sources of energy, and that was increasing constantly. And people said that meant that the US would be unable to maintain its position of power. But that was before the so-called shale revolution, in which the technologies of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling were applied to shale rock in the US. And now the US has become the world's largest oil producer, and the International Energy Agency sees North America as being largely energy independent in the next decade. China, on the contrary, while it has some shale rock, doesn't have the water that it needs to go with it, and China is increasing its dependence on Middle Eastern oil. So while the US is less dependent, China is increasingly dependent on imported energy sources. And a third area that you might say is illustration of why the US is not in decline relates to technology. If you take the major technologies, the leading technologies of the 21st century, nanotechnology, biotechnology, the next generation of information and technology, including artificial intelligence, and you ask what country is at the forefront of all these technologies, it's the United States. This is not the picture of a country in decline. This is not Britain compared to Germany in 1914. What's more, if you look at the quality of the universities, the research universities that maintain these structures, Shanghai Jiaotong University did a study of the top research universities in the world. They found that of the top 20 research universities, 15 of the 20 were in the United States. None of them were in China. So the picture that is conventional, that because of all of our problems, the US is in decline, that China is taking over, and this is going to create this great war, I think is badly exaggerated and doesn't fit the facts. Nonetheless, humans make mistakes. Sometimes our perceptions are more important than the reality. and exaggerated fears can lead people to miscalculations. And I think that's an area that leads us to believe that we have to be careful that we don't let the Thucydides trap become what I would call a self-fulfilling prophecy. Fortunately, I think the American public has not yet succumbed to the historical portrait of China as an inevitable enemy, though opinions of China have decreased or gone down in both political parties over the last few years. But the view that the United States is turning inward and will not be willing to stand up to China, I don't think is true. The Chicago Council on Foreign Relations has a poll which it's been taking since 1974, in which they ask Americans, do you want a forward, outward foreign policy, or should we spend more of our time and money at home? That, over the years, has roughly vacillated between about 62% at the bottom and about 70% at the top of people who want an outward-looking foreign policy. Another way of putting it is that there's always about a third of the American public which is isolationist. But of that two-thirds, you'll find that the interesting thing is that in 2016, during the election, about 64% of the public who wanted an outward foreign policy. Today, the latest poll taken by the Chicago Council has gone up to 70% who want an outward foreign policy. There's a disjunction between the view that President Trump is turning away from outside world and where public opinion is. So I think in that sense, the view that the Americans are going to retreat inward and leave Asia to China is simply not true. In fact, basically, if you look at the aspirations that China has, some people say that China desires to expel the U.S. from East Asia and that it wants to expel the U.S. Beyond what they call the first island chain. Forget the fact that the first island chain has a name. A large part of it is Japan, which is by far the most powerful and important country. And Japan has a very close alliance with the United States, to the point that it even pays 3/4 of the host nation's support of keeping American troops here. And in that sense, if the U.S. and Japan maintain their alliance, there's absolutely no way that China can expel the U.S. from the Western Pacific. So that threat, I think, is, again, greatly exaggerated. My impression from talking with friends is that despite some of the uncertainties caused by the style of President Trump, and by his actions, such as his recent actions in the Middle East, despite those uncertainties, that in fact the alliance between the U.S. and Japan is really very strong. If you ask people in the Congress about their importance of the U.S.-Japan alliance, you ask people in the bureaucracy, you ask people in the military, or even if you look at public opinion polls, you'll see very strong support for the U.S.-Japan alliance. So in that sense, I think the argument that China is in the stronger position and will try to drive the U.S. from the Western Pacific is not a very high probability. In that sense, as long as the U.S. and Japan hold together, keep our alliance together, we can shape the environment in which Chinese power rises and prevent them from dominating. So in that sense, we don't have to succumb to the fear of a Thucydides trap. Remember, if you go back to the original proposition of Thucydides, the war was caused by the rise in the power of Athens and the fear it created in Sparta. We don't have to succumb to that type of fear about the rise of China. And it'll be very important that we keep a balance in our views of China. We don't want to either underestimate or overestimate the rise of Chinese power. And that's something which US and Japan have to share and work on together to keep our perceptions in consonance with each other. With that said, and in conclusion, let me point out that there's another dimension besides this question of historical analogies and threats about why we don't want to over-exaggerate the fear of China. Basically, the US-China and and the Japan-China relationship will be what I call a cooperative rivalry. There will be areas of rivalry, but there'll also be areas where we have a strong interest in cooperation. And many of the challenges that both our countries face, Japan and the US, are going to be impossible to resolve without being able to cooperate with China. The most important of these is, of course, the problem of climate change. Climate change is one of the major problems we face in this century, and there's no way that we can solve it alone. It does no good to have a policy of restricting carbon dioxide production in Japan or the US if there's not something where we cooperate to have China also restrict the carbon intensity of its growth. Sea levels that come from rising carbon dioxide, sea level rises, obey the laws of physics, not the laws of politics. And as borders become more porous to everything from illicit drugs to infectious diseases and pandemics to terrorism, the US, China, and Japan will have to cooperate to cope with these threats. And of course, Europe will have to be part of that cooperation as well. Some aspects of the relationship will involve a positive sum game. And in that sense, US and Japanese security will require power with China, not just power over China. The key question is whether we'll be able to develop the ability to work on a cooperative rivalry in which we can pay attention to both terms of that phrase at the same time. We have to realize that there'll be areas where we will compete with China and areas where we'll cooperate with China, and we'll have to learn to do both at the same time. If we're able to do that, then I think we can avoid this threat both of a new Cold War and a threat of a Thucydides trap. But as I said earlier, in human history, we have often, as humans, made serious mistakes and miscalculations. So our worry should be that we either underestimate or overestimate the problem of the rise of China. And I think if we are able to keep a balance in those estimations, we will be able to manage this relationship in a way where the US and Japan can both benefit. But again, the key to that, in my view, is to maintain the solidity of the US-Japan alliance and security treaty, which seems to be one of the key questions for the success and stability of this 21st century. Thank you very much.
ナイ先生、ありがとうございました。政治、外交、防衛、経済だけでなく、温暖化についてまで触れていただきました。ありがとうございました。